All right, kiddos. So we talked about Indiana in the Civil War, and now we're going to talk more about what happened in Indiana after the Civil War. So we really started discovering a lot of new resources and machineries, which really helped grow the state's economy. Economy is the way a place like a business or a state or the entire country or the world uses like resources to produce goods and services. So that's your economy. Railroads had a huge impact on the economy at the time. So these like mid 18 to late 1800s were kind of like the time of the farmers, right? So pretty much everybody in Indiana worked on farms. So a lot of the people that didn't work on farms still worked on industries that processed things from the farmers. So all of these things were connected by the farms. We grew grain and vegetables and fruit. Every county in the state of Indiana at that time had a mill to process grain into flour. A lot of them had livestock for meat, and there were meat packing plants all along your major rivers like the Wabash and the Ohio River. That growth really kind of helped inspire this need to create new materials and tools. Once we find something that works, right, we always are looking for a way to make it better, more efficient, faster. And so people started trying to create things to meet those needs. So one person that was really successful in creating a new tool to meet the needs of the farmers was a man named James Oliver, who is actually from South Bend, Indiana. So he was up in South Bend and invented a type of steel plow. So it had a much stronger blade, and it kept that sharp edge a lot longer than the old plows. It became hugely popular. It actually became the largest owned plow in the entire world at that time. So his plow and a lot of these other machines that got created at the time were increasing productivity. So what that means is that it's all about the amount of goods or services that workers can make or provide in a set amount of time. So they're making a lot more in a lot less time. So they could do things more quickly, and they could make a lot better use of their resources. So the only downside to that was that because they were able to make a lot more, there was a lot more available. And so those prices started going down. We talked before about how, there wasn't very much corn in some other states. And so they were able to grow corn and then use transportation to sell it in areas that didn't have it as much. But now, because of all of this new machinery, people were able to grow a lot more, a lot faster. And so the demand wasn't as high. So they started losing money. They started losing profit. And that profit is the money a business earns off after like all the expenses are paid. So they pay the bills, they pay for the gas for the machine, they pay for the machine, and then whatever money is left over, that's their profit, right? And so this profit margin was going down, and they weren't making as much money. So the railroad had a huge impact on this. So the railroad was great in a lot of ways because it connected us with everywhere. And so people were working to build railroads. And that's really kind of the first railroad was in about 1840. And by 14 years later, we had 1,400 miles of railroad in the state of Indiana. It was great as far as people were able to ship, as those farmers were able to ship their products so much faster to get to other places. But the downside was that these railroads, you had to pay to use their shipping services, right? So it's like Amazon, right? Like if you want to buy something off of Amazon, you still have to pay for shipping, right? So back then it was very similar. The railroads were like, yeah, we'll definitely ship your grain and your corn and your meat to this other state, but you're going to have to pay us to do it. And they made they made it a really high cost. And so not only were farmers already making less money because they had less profits because productivity was up, but now they're making less profit because they're also paying a ridiculous amount of money in shipping. And so a lot of farmers were going into debt over how much money they were having to pay for shipping. So the farmers were frustrated, obviously, and they wanted the railroads to lower the price. But the railroad companies were pretty smart and pretty connected, and so they just found ways to keep their prices high. Like they just would talk to each other and be like, hey, let's all agree that we're all going to charge this much money for it. And so farmers couldn't leave and say, well, I'm not using you, I'm going to use this other railroad, because they were all charging the exact same, so it didn't matter where they went. Every railroad was charging a ridiculous amount, so they couldn't get better deals. So farmers started deciding that they wanted to get together to really fight against this stuff and fight for more rights for farmers. And so Oliver Hudson Kelley formed this organization called the Grange, and this started in 1867. So the Grange was designed for two reasons. First, he really wanted to teach farmers about like the best way to farm, but then he also wanted to make a stand against the railroad prices. So by the mid 1870s, like within a few years, there were Grange groups in every single state, and Indiana and Missouri actually had the two largest groups. The two largest organizations. In the entire country, there were more than 800,000 men and women who made up these Grange groups. So they did put pressure on the state and political leaders. They demanded that the political leaders would regulate the railroads. They would put in rules and regulations and all of those things to kind of maintain control over these railroad systems. And they basically said, like, look, we're not going to vote for you if you don't agree that you're going to do this stuff. And so at first that worked. They were like, great, awesome. They passed some rules, prices got changed. But again, the railroad systems, they were pretty powerful. So they kind of pushed back, and those rules were changed pretty quickly after. So farmers were still kind of struggling there. We did find some resources that also really helped in that time. So we found a lot of coal along the Wabash River, and as railroad grew, the companies began mining that coal to really help power the trains. And then soon the trains were then carrying coal to more parts of the country. A lot of that was coming from Terre Haute area. They also discovered natural gas in the east part of Indiana in 1867. Engineers and scientists were trying to figure out how to use that natural gas as a source of power for lighting. And they began testing ways, and as they started kind of using these gas wells and drills, they started putting them in Eaton and Portland in 1886, and they were able to provide huge supplies of natural gas. A lot of cities then used that to their advantage to get people to move there. So Muncie, Marion, Anderson were saying like, oh, hey, build your new business here because we're going to offer you free natural gas. We're not going to charge for it. So a lot of places were like, heck yeah, like we're going to go there because that's going to be really cheap. So they got a lot of entrepreneurs at that time. And an entrepreneur is somebody who has like a really good idea for something, or they think it's a good idea at least, and they're willing to risk a lot of money and time to see if it takes off, to see if it's something that people really want to do. So in 1876, Eli Lilly came to Indiana, in Indianapolis, and started to manufacture medicine. And Eli Lilly is still in Indianapolis today and is a huge company. In 1887, we had the Ball brothers move from New York to Muncie, Indiana. And the Ball brothers really made mason jars. So, if you've ever seen a mason jar or used a mason jar, the Ball brothers really started a lot of that with their glass making. Also, Madam C.J. Walker, who we've studied before, she also moved her company to Indiana a little bit later in 1910, but she became the first female African-American millionaire in the United States from her products for African-American hair. So we had a lot of people moving to our area because we were making it so enticing with those resources. A lot of people thought that the state supply of natural gas would just like last forever, right? They were like, yeah, we can offer it for free because it's going to be here literally forever. Natural gas will never go away. But by 1898, we had used up pretty much everything we had. And so they needed something else, and they ended up discovering oil. So by 1889, they found it in southwest Indiana, and they began looking at ways to kind of clean it up and use it as gasoline and kerosene. Um, that same year, the Standard Oil began building these huge oil refinery. The big one was in Whiting on Lake Michigan. So an oil refinery is just like a factory where oil gets processed and turned into gasoline and other products. So the oil wells and refineries provided tons of new jobs, which was also really great for Indiana's economy, specifically in Northwest Indiana where we are. That was really big for us at that time. So that pretty much sums up your chapter there. I hope that helps answer your questions. Thanks.